Historical counterexamples. And I don't know if this is going to work. Let's try it. Do people with more experience in government make better presidents? I'm going to see if this will pull up the National Public Radio program that talks about this. Yeah, here we go. Listen to the story. Let's listen to the story. Here we are. Oh, there's an advertisement. We don't want that.
The sounds in here might not work.
It may not. I'm going to play with it just a second. Okay. There's no mute on. There's not that, and probably.
The box up there on the right, at the ceiling?
Yeah, this one.
I think so.
That's on.
The one next to the computer on.
That says on. Maybe not. Let's try it. That's on. Oh, it's not going to work. Anyway, I can briefly summarize what they say. They have a discussion with a historian. They say, is it the case that experience and effectiveness as a leader go together? Are the best presidents the one that come into office with lots of previous political and government experience? They talk to a historian, and he says, I don't think there's any relationship between these two variables. And he says, well, what makes you say that? He says, well, Abraham Lincoln was probably America's greatest president, and he had practically no experience at all in government. And he comes up with another president. He says, this guy had served for decades in government and had all sorts. He was a governor. He was a vice president. He was everything. He'd done everything that was possible to do, and he was, by everyone's agreement, one of the worst presidents in history. What he's saying is, if you tell me there's a positive relationship that more experience leads to more effective presidents, I can give you two exceptions to that rule. A very inexperienced guy who turned out to be very effective, and a very experienced guy who turned out to be very ineffective. Therefore, he's concluded, there is no relationship between these two variables. And he basically says as much of that, if I could have got the sound to work. Now, this guy named Hess says James Buchanan was the one. He said lots of experience, was a terrible president. Abraham Lincoln had very little experience, was one of our greatest presidents. So what they're saying is, we know that there is at least some highly experienced but bad presidents and some very inexperienced but good presidents. But what more can we say about the existence or non-existence of a relationship between these two variables? Nothing. We don't know. We would have to take all the presidents and classify them as being effective or ineffective, and then take all the presidents and classify them as having lots or very little experience, and then see if there's any difference in the rate of effectiveness as we vary variable A, experience, do we find changes in variable B, effectiveness. But we can't begin to answer that question with what we have, which is just data on these two single cells. He started by just giving us one example. They said, I'll give you another counterexample. And so that surely proves that there's no rule here. There could still be a rule. There could be a strong rule. But these could be exceptions to that strong rule. Yeah? So, we do know that not all good, we know that there's not a perfect relationship such that if you're highly experienced, you're always among the most effective presidents, and if you're inexperienced, you're always among the most ineffective presidents. We know that that's not true. But we knew before we started that probably if there was any relationship at all, it was going to be imperfect. Maybe this just shows those imperfections. Maybe experience is a predictor of effectiveness, and these are just some interesting exceptions to that rule. Right? We don't know from these counterexamples whether or not there's any general relationship at all. In fact, we can't establish that with what we've been given. And if you could look at it, I don't want to pick on historians because oftentimes they don't have very much data. They're not able to look at all presidents and make a full, thorough analysis. But a lot of historical analysis that I've seen is exactly this nature. They say, well, I think there is a relationship. Is there a relationship between height and leadership? No. How come? Because Napoleon was short. Hitler was short, relatively short. So don't tell me that taller people are more likely to be chosen as leaders. But if you go and look at the full data, look at all leaders, you'll find that they're on average taller than average, than non-leaders. Turns out there is a relationship between, in the United States presidential elections, there have been 40-some presidential elections, 40 presidents, or in only one of all those elections has the shorter candidate prevailed. Yeah.
Is that some kind of fallacy? Because I was looking at something and they were saying stuff about that this celebrity says this, and that seemed to make it brilliant, even though all the normal people thought it was terrible.
There are actually some pretty good data on the leadership stuff, and it seems to be perceived leadership. Like you do studies where you'll say, here are two people that you could elect as your chairperson of your committee, and you equate everything: their physical attractiveness, their dress, their gender, their age, everything else. But one is somewhat taller than the other. There's a strong preference for the taller one or the shorter one. In presidential debates now, since they've learned about this, they arrange things so they put step stools behind the podium so that they will look exactly the same height, even if one of them is actually shorter. But there comes that moment at the end of the thing where they have to come and shake one another's hands, where then one will be looking up at the other one, and they hate that moment. They probably give them lifts or something in their shoes so that they can walk over and stare at them eye to eye and look just as tall as the other one. Yes?
It's going to make it really difficult for a woman ever to become a president, because I mean, on average, women are usually smaller than men, so...
It's another handicap. It's another
More
handicap.
feisty, though.
Yeah, but if you have that, if it's quite a strong relationship between...
Or maybe it argues for high heels among political women politicians. I don't know if you could help take up some of the
you do have
difference.
that in offices, doesn't it? That a lot of women, well, it's kind of like an untold law to wear high heels.
Well, it may be that they reflect that there is a relationship, it turns out, a predictive relationship between height and likelihood of being selected a leader. Is there a relationship between experience and how effective they are? I don't know. I haven't seen all the data. But no historical analysis based upon these sort of isolated examples can establish it one way or the other. Okay. Now, what's the roots of this error? Why do we make this error? Why does it sound so compelling to us when we say, I know a man who smokes all the time and he has no lung problems. Smoking couldn't be that dangerous, could it?
Is it because we sort of associate ourselves as being similar to them, so we think, oh, that's not going to happen to us either? So we assume, just because we know them, that they're similar, so we wouldn't have the same
In fact,
effect.
we engage in a kind of overgeneralization that this guy will represent not just us, but probably everybody. Right? In fact, I think that the roots of every one of the errors that we're talking about stems from this assumption that all relationships are in fact perfect ones, rules without exceptions. So let's consider this one we've just been talking about, experience and effectiveness among presidents. Let's take the first 40 presidents, and you could maybe judge their effectiveness. That is, some are above average, some are below average, so you could have high effectiveness and low effectiveness. And we could certainly measure their experience in government, whether they'd had lots or very little experience in government, right? So we could fill in the whole table. Now, that would result in a contingency table. Now, if we live in a world where if there's any relationship at all between these two variables, it's a perfect one. So we have three possibilities. Here are the three possibilities in terms of contingency tables. There's a perfect relationship between experience and effectiveness, and it's a positive one. If you're highly experienced, then you'll be very effective. If you're inexperienced, you'll be ineffective. And there are no exceptions to the rule at all. That's one possibility. It could be exactly the other way around. Experience ruins you as an effective president. So all the highly experienced people are terrible presidents, and it's the inexperienced ones who can come on and do a good job. Perfect relationship, again, it's just the opposite way around. Or the third possibility is there's no relationship at all. The odds of being effective are exactly the same for those who are experienced versus those who are inexperienced. And if we started with 40 presidents and we divided them at the midpoint, half are effective, half are not, half are inexperienced, half are not, that's what the table would have to look like. So under the assumption that all relationships are perfect relationships, that's the only set of possibilities that exist. Yes?
Isn't that also like with all other heuristics that it's just like a way of like being fast and
Exactly.
spending time there?
Exactly. Exactly. It's a heuristic. Wouldn't the world be simple if knowing if somebody smokes tells me everything I need to know about the risk of cancer? Wouldn't it be nice if experience level of a politician was all I need to know? It's a shortcut. These two things are related. Doesn't that mean that the rule is a hard and fast rule without any exceptions? It's a simplifying heuristic. Exactly. Exactly. Now we can make, if this was the kind of world we really lived in, where all the relationships had to be perfect instead of the world that we've been talking about, the real world we live in, where none of the relationships are perfect, or very few of them are perfect, this would not be an error. Why? Suppose our friend, the historian Stephen Hess, was correct, that Buchanan was a highly experienced but highly ineffectual president, and Lincoln was a highly inexperienced but very effective president. What does that tell us? That says that there are at least some people in that cell and that cell. If there are some people in those two cells, this is eliminated as a possibility. Okay? So we can get rid of that. Okay. Yeah, that's gone. And if we can find exceptions the other way, such as, suppose I can say that George Washington, the first president, the great president of the United States, was also a general and was a leader in the Continental Congress and did all these kinds of things. So he had lots and lots of experience compared to other people at the time. So that says there are some people with lots of experience who are good presidents. What does that do? That means that's not possible. So these single exceptions can rule out these perfect relationships, which leaves only one possibility, that there's no relationship at all. We can disprove the rule with some exceptions. But all we're disproving is that the relationships are perfect, not that there's no relationship at all between the variables. We don't live in this kind of world. This is an error. It would only not be an error if we lived in this make-believe world where all relationships had to be perfect or they couldn't exist at all. Yeah. All right. Now, let's talk a little bit about some of the factors that make us make this error, and your observation, Nadine, right, is going to be very important here, because if this is a heuristic, if this is a simplifying shortcut that we take to say, well, all right, all I need is one observation, one exception will disprove the rule, one observation, one confirmation will prove the rule. Remember, if it's a perfect relationship, all the observations have to fall in one diagonal. So if I can find an observation in one of those diagonals, and it's only a perfect relationship, that could be taken as strong evidence that that's the diagonal that has the perfect relationship, right? I worked hard all my life and I'm successful. That must be where all the cases fall in that diagonal. Work hard and succeed, don't work hard and fail. It's that kind of simple world. There are no exceptions to that hard and fast rule. Right? But the question is, when are we most likely to make this mistake? And this gets us back to what we talked about much earlier in the course. When do we rely upon heuristics, generally speaking? And the answer is when we lack the motivation to think more carefully about it. So we really don't care about the question. We don't care if we get it right or not. We don't care if this herbal treatment would affect hair growth because our hair is doing quite nicely. Thank you. So we don't care. So we'll rely upon a heuristic. The testimonial will say, okay, if it worked for Hans, I guess it'll work for everybody. But I don't need it, so I don't care. Right? Or we said we don't want to look like we care too much, or we're too obsessive about being too thorough and careful a thinker about that. That might take away our motivation to think carefully about the possible alternatives